On May the 8th, 1889, Vincent van Gogh is admitted to a mental asylum outside Saint-Rémy in Provence. He would spend just over a year there. It was originally planned that he'd go to a large public institution in Marseille with over 1,000 patients, right in the heart of the city. If he had, there is no chance he would have produced the extraordinary work he did. In the small asylum at Saint-Rémy, with only 41 patients, Vincent would be treated with kindness and understanding. The doctors quickly recognized that painting was central to his well-being. He was given the space and freedom to work, and the asylum staff generally encouraged his artistic practice. In the asylum, as other patients screamed throughout the night, Vincent's creativity and work ethic remained extraordinary. He spent every waking hour painting, producing mostly optimistic landscapes. He worked with remarkable speed, often finishing a painting in just a few hours. Incredibly, considering his circumstances, he completed at least 150 paintings during his stay at Saint-Rémy, roughly one painting every other day. And it was on the 18th of June 1889 that he painted the Starry Night. In popular culture, Van Gogh is often seen as the archetypal mad artist. Yet most of the time he was lucid, rational, and deeply engaged with the world around him. He approached painting with astonishing discipline, studied color theory obsessively, analyzed other artists, and worked to a schedule. Behind the mythology was a hard-working, dedicated man, serious about his craft. He was also intelligent, articulate, and exceptionally well-read. He spoke 4 languages, knew art history intimately, and maintained friendships and correspondences throughout his life. But he struggled to understand his place in the world. After a particularly difficult period living with Paul Gauguin, he suffered a serious mental health crisis that culminated in hallucinations and hearing voices, leading to the incident in which he cut off part of his ear. The doctors at the asylum diagnosed epilepsy, although Vincent's condition remains the subject of debate among historians and medical researchers. What is clear is that he experienced periods of severe mental distress, hallucinations, and episodes that interrupted his work and daily life. He called his fellow patients his companions in misfortune, and recent research suggests that Vincent was often more lucid and self-aware than many of those around him. Overall, the asylum had a positive effect on him, and he was well enough to paint about 75% of the time. One visitor, when he came to see Vincent, found him to be in perfect physical and mental health, and after he left the asylum, he went to Paris to visit his brother Theo, whose wife Jo remarked on how healthy he looked. In the asylum he was drinking a lot less, no absinthe, no complicated romances, and a regular routine with 3 meals a day. Isolation turned out to be good for him, and with no outside distractions, Vincent, always a hard worker, would channel all his energies into his work. When we think of 19th century asylums, we think of them as horrific institutions. But the founder of Saint-Rémy Asylum was a progressive who believed that being surrounded by nature was good for troubled minds and had planted extensive gardens. He also believed in the healing power of art and music. Of course, it was not easy for Vincent, and he suffered attacks when he was unable to paint. But it could have been a lot worse. His brother Theo, who was paying for the treatment, insisted that the asylum allowed Vincent to paint, and he was given a dedicated studio. His paintings are often represented as evidence of madness, but the reality may be closer to the opposite. Painting gave Vincent structure, purpose, and meaning. He created these images despite his illness, not because of it. However, as he was led into his sparse cell on the first day, he must have been terrified. but also reassured to find that, although his window had bars, the view was spectacular. Wheat fields glowed in the sun, with olive groves and vineyards receding into the distant foothills of a low mountain range called Les Alpilles. Initially, he portrayed the world he saw from his room, the subject of many paintings at the asylum. But within weeks he would be allowed to wander around the dramatic countryside alone. The morning after his arrival at the asylum, Vincent went into the walled garden, set up his easel, and by lunchtime had painted this, the first of his asylum masterpieces. Van Gogh was a largely self-taught artist who didn't seriously pick up a paintbrush until he was 27 years old, and just 10 years later he would be dead. It was really his last 4 years where he developed the style we would come to know him by, and these were also his most prolific years. Once he found his way, it was as if he was making up for lost time. Vincent's 2 years in Paris up until February 1888 are widely seen as laying the foundation for his later unique style, exposing him to the influence of impressionists such as Monet and Pissarro, but also a younger generation of artists, including Paul Signac, Émile Bernard and Toulouse-Lautrec, who will all remain lifelong friends. Like many of that generation, he was influenced by Japanese prints, which along with his Paris years would have a transformative effect on his work, and lay the foundations for radical works like The Starry Night. We know for a fact that Vincent was an admirer of Hokusai's The Great Wave, and here we can make comparisons, not only between the composition, but also between the rich blue tones of Hokusai's tempestuous seas and the turbulent skies of The Starry Night. Alongside these Japanese prints and the innovations of Paris, Vincent remained deeply influenced by the peasant paintings of Jean-François Millet, who he saw almost like a spiritual guide. Millet's images of peasants sowing, harvesting and working the land deeply influenced Van Gogh's belief that ordinary rural life was a worthy subject for art. In Paris, he went to see this ceiling mural by Eugène Delacroix in the Louvre, and it was a revelation how bright contrasting colours could work together. Vincent proceeded to read everything he could on Delacroix's colour theories, which involved placing opposite colours on the colour wheel together, a combination which gives high contrast and high impact, for example, red and green or blue and orange. This had a profound impact on Vincent's later paintings, when the bright new palette takes over from his previous dark muted colour scheme. A period that also coincided with the invention of many new synthetic pigments that Vincent took advantage of. Colour, above all, was Vincent's visual vocabulary. With these later works, we also see more and more Japanese influence. Blocks of pure colour, dark outlines, no shadows, unusual cropping, and distorted perspective. Having started so late, Vincent spent the final years of his life absorbing all of these influences with extraordinary intensity, and transforming them into a style that was unmistakably his own. This morning I saw the countryside from my window, a long time before sunrise, with nothing but the morning star, which looked very big. This was one of the many letters Vincent wrote to friends that mentioned a starry night, and it was something he had planned for a while. The painting depicts the view from his asylum window on the upper floor. He had already painted the view dozens of times, but this time it was a nocturne, which, as he couldn't paint in the dark, meant it was painted from memory during the day in his ground floor studio. Like the Impressionists, Vincent insisted on working from nature, but a few months earlier, Paul Gauguin had tried to persuade him to paint from his imagination. Vincent resisted then, but in the asylum, with limited freedom of movement, it was a necessity. The Starry Night is one of those rare moments. He is no longer simply recording the world in front of him, he is transforming it, creating in paint something we cannot see or touch, something immaterial. By combining observation with memory, imagination and emotion, he is not creating a view from a window, but rather a vision of the world transformed through his experience. This is a critical moment in the history of art. Artists were increasingly moving away from factual descriptions towards something more subjective. Art was becoming a way of expressing how the world feels rather than simply how it looks. Vincent uses paint to create a sky that feels electric, alive, and in motion, and in doing so, he helps pave the way for modern art. The views he painted from his window are all linked by the diagonal line coming in from the right, depicting the low rolling hills. In reality, the cypress trees were much smaller and beyond the far wall enclosing the wheat field. For Starry Night, Vincent brings the tree much closer to the picture plane, which reminds us of the tight cropping we see in Japanese prints. The cypress tree was a newly discovered motif for Vincent, and is seen as the symbol of death in Mediterranean culture. Here, the tree shoots up into the sky, linking heaven and earth. Vincent himself compared cypresses to Egyptian obelisks and saw them as beautiful rather than mournful, symbols of transcendence. The white band hanging over the hills is almost certainly the morning mist. By the time he painted the Starry Night, he was allowed out to explore the area alone, and it was on one of these walks he drew this bird's-eye view of the village. In the painting, he places the village in the valley, even though it was not visible from Vincent's room or from his studio, and was in fact in the opposite direction. He shows a dozen or so houses, whereas in fact there were hundreds. He has those houses lit by impossibly bright gas lamps as a device to balance out the yellow stars above. Vincent paints an idealized village, and it bears no resemblance to the real one, or even its domed church of Saint-Rémy. The church is unmistakably Northern European, rather than Provençal. This is an easy detail to miss, but it is important. Because the Starry Night is not really a landscape in the traditional sense. It is not about recording a place accurately. Vincent is assembling memories, observations, symbols, and emotions into a single image. The village below becomes less a real settlement than an idea of home. It is the contrast between the sleeping, motionless village and the swirling, turbulent skies that creates much of the emotional power of the picture, that creates the tension. Above, the universe seems to pulse with energy. Below, human life remains quiet and fragile. In a sense, the painting becomes a meeting place between the landscapes of Provence and the memories of home. The sky is painted with Vincent's signature short brushstrokes of thick impasto, his personal vocabulary of mark-making. We can see how he applies the impasto technique, painting so thickly, sometimes straight from the tube, spreading paint like butter with a palette knife. In places, the paint stands out of the canvas by several millimeters. This means it catches the light and gives the painting a physical presence that reproductions struggle to show. Technical studies show that the Starry Night was painted with remarkable confidence. There is very little reworking. The brushstrokes may appear spontaneous, but they were carefully controlled and laid down with astonishing speed. This contributes to the sense of immediacy and vitality, making us, the viewer, aware not only of what Vincent saw, but of the physical act of him painting it. It is these paint-heavy, stabbing brushstrokes that distinguishes Vincent from the other post-impressionists. Colour was simply Vincent's way of communicating, and he had an innate and even avant-garde tendency towards colours that were expressive and intense. He took all that he had learned about complementary colour theory and applied it to the Starry Night. And it was the Impressionists in Paris that gave him looser, lighter brushstrokes, and the pointillist Georges Seurat who introduced him to optical mixing, pure colours blended by the eye to form a coherent image. The blues are not simply flat areas of colour. He layers different shades, cobalt blue, ultramarine, and touches of green and violet, allowing them to vibrate against one another. The yellows and oranges of the stars are placed against these blues to create maximum intensity, drawing on those colour theories of Delacroix.
But new research finds that these famous swirls actually match up with our
But
current
is it an accurate depiction of the stars on or around June the 18th? Astronomers have worked out that the moon that night was actually almost full, rather than the crescent moon we see in the painting, a motif we often find in Japanese prints. And Venus, the brightest star, was only visible just before dawn, by which time the moon was not visible from Vincent's room. In this recreation, we can see the constellation Aries was also visible. I think it's clear the Starry Night is an amalgamation of nighttime and dawn views from his window. But just how stylized are Vincent's swirling galaxies? If we look at a modern image of the Whirlpool Galaxy, it bears a striking resemblance to Vincent's stars. But could he have known about spiral galaxies back in 1889? This drawing, made by the English astronomer Lord Rosse in 1850, was reproduced as an etching in a French astronomy book, which had caused a sensation, and Vincent, who was passionate about astronomy, had even met the author in Paris. In 2004, physicists studying fluid turbulence noticed something extraordinary. The patterns in the Starry Night appeared to resemble mathematical structures found in turbulent flows. Whether Vincent understood any of this is irrelevant. What matters is that he somehow found a visual language capable of expressing forces that are invisible but deeply familiar to us. His brother Theo would later say that the Starry Night was style over substance, and even Vincent had doubts about it. He worried that he had strayed too far from nature and into abstraction. Ironically, what both brothers saw as a weakness is exactly what later generations would celebrate. Like all great paintings, the Starry Night has been interpreted in many ways, notably concerning Vincent's religious beliefs. Although he became an evangelical preacher in his 20s, he later rejected Christianity. But when Vincent lost his faith, he transferred many of his ideas into his art. Hard work and the appreciation of nature were seen as part of the worship of God in the Protestant tradition in which he was raised. His art had always emphasized the changing and renewing powers of the seasons, and there was no harder working artist than Vincent. In less than a decade, he created around 2,100 artworks, including around 860 oil paintings, most of which date from the last 2 years of his life. Vincent often spoke of art as a new religion, a way to console people, and the Starry Night in particular reflected these beliefs. Nature for him was a source of the infinite, and the stars had a deep spiritual meaning. Stars that must have been a comfort as he gazed at the night sky from his cell. In one letter, Vincent wrote that looking at the stars made him think about death in the same way that trains made us think about distant destinations. Not as something frightening, but as a journey into the unknown. The stars offered perspective. They reminded him that human troubles were small when measured against the vastness of the universe. Few paintings have entered popular culture quite like the Starry Night, yet its popularity may stem from something surprisingly simple. Most landscapes show us the world as it appears. The Starry Night shows us the world as it feels. We may never have stood in Vincent's room at Saint-Rémy, but we can recognize wonder, loneliness, hope, and uncertainty. The painting feels personal to Vincent, yet somehow belongs to all of us. Van Gogh considered the Starry Night a failure. He felt it relied too much on imagination and not enough on direct observation. Yet, it is precisely this departure from reality that makes the painting so extraordinarily powerful. Millions of people recognize themselves in those swirling skies, not because Vincent was a genius driven by madness, but because he achieved something far more difficult. He found a way to transform private experience into something universal. Standing in a small asylum room in Provence, looking out through a barred window, Vincent van Gogh painted a vision of the infinite. More than a century later, those stars still seem to move, and the sky still seems alive. And somehow, we are still looking out of that window with him.